Good afternoon and welcome to the Crocker Art Museum. My name is Houghton Kinsman and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator here at the museum. Before we begin today's program, I'll read a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Crocker Art Museum is on the traditional land of the Nisenan people, and the current state of California is the homeland of many tribes. We are honored to be here today and acknowledge our responsibility to these Native nations and our commitment to work with them as we move forward as an inclusive institution. So I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this virtual walkthrough of the exhibition, Another World, the Transcendental Painting Group. We'll begin the program with the virtual walkthrough before the curator of the exhibition, Another World, Michael Duncan, joins us to share his thoughts on some of the artists and artwork in the exhibition and what the process was like in organizing such a thought-provoking survey. So a reminder to please use the chat for any questions you would like Michael to answer, and don't forget that today's program is just one of over a myriad of programs in the month of November. So be sure to check out our website, crockerart.org, to sign up for upcoming programs. I hope you'll enjoy the walkthrough, and I look forward to chatting with Michael afterwards.
What I hope comes out of this show is a heightened appreciation of beauty as it is manifested in art. These works all tap into something profound and something that I think almost any viewer can relate to.
Trying to write about what they were trying to do is very difficult because they were into some extremely esoteric material that is hard to understand unless you're really steeped in it. But the good part about it is that you don't need to understand any of it to really appreciate the beauty of the paintings. That the forms, the colors, the light, the mysticism, it all just comes through, and they're just gorgeous to look at.
Regardless of their fears or skepticism about what abstraction is, these are works that really speak to your gut, that really kind of speak to your essence as a human being.
The Transcendental Painting Group was an association of artists that came together mostly in New Mexico. One of the artists, Agnes Pelton, was from California. But what they really set out to do was to imbue abstraction with spiritual qualities. And they were doing this in the 1930s and 40s, at a period when most of America was doing representational scene painting. And so it was very much a different movement out on their own. That's why a lot of people haven't known about them very much until recently, in that they were running against the grain and really against the current and trying to do something that nobody else at the time was doing. They're more in line with the American modernists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Marston Hartley and Arthur Dove, except they saw themselves as different from that as well. They really saw themselves as permeating their work with something deeper than the surface.
There were 10 artists: Raymond Johnson, Emil Beestrom. They were the two ringleaders, and they brought in Agnes Pelton from California into the group. Beestrom's students, three of Beestrom's students were in the group: Florence Pierce, Horace Pierce, and Robert Gribrick. Another artist that they brought in was a Canadian artist, a very well-known Canadian artist, Lauren Harris, who was living in Santa Fe for a couple of years, and Ed Garman, who was kind of an acolyte of Johnson, who came into the group. And then there was the one artist actually from New Mexico, William Lumpkins.
They each came at it from a slightly different perspective. Some came from more of a background in Buddhism, some were Theosophy, some had a more geometric bent, some were more based in nature, but they all had this one overriding theme in common. And it was in 1938 that they really came together, and it was Emil Beestrom and Raymond Johnson kind of led two contingents, and they, because it was New Mexico and there weren't a lot of other artists doing things like them, they all came together and started to see themselves as a group, and there was a manifesto And it talked about what they were trying to do, which was very different than most American artists at the time.
Well, they thought long and hard about what to call themselves and came up with the transcendental word, choosing that over non-objective, and they didn't use the word abstraction. But I think it shows that they wanted to focus on the philosophy, on a kind of philosophical, spiritual element in their work. Light was so much a part of how they all responded to New Mexico landscape. They all talked about, when they first moved there, just the incredible light and that brought out the colors of the desert mountains and the desert scape. It's interesting because Johnson, when he was a young man, one of his first jobs was to work for an experimental theater group in Chicago in the teens in 1919 or something, called the Little Theater, and he was in charge of the lighting. And that theater became well known for doing very stripped down minimalist sets. And the sets and the decor of the plays that they were doing was controlled by lighting, by very subtle changes in lighting. And you can see light and the way he manipulates light in all of his paintings is really skilled and really thoughtful. And I think that that's true. It's certainly true in Pelton and actually all of the other painters in the group, that they were aware of how light can illuminate in more ways than one, in kind of a spiritual way, in a formal way, to really to bring a painting to life. Each of them came to New Mexico in a different way. Well, first of all, Pelton never did come to New Mexico. She worked in a small town outside of Palm Springs called Cathedral City, and she moved there when she was 50 years old. She had already had a long career in New York and had been more or less a symbolist painter. And she eventually became disgruntled. Her studio in New York had structural problems, and she actually wanted to make a huge change in her life. And after investigating a lot of locations, she chose to live in the middle of the desert. And for her, it was a real blossoming experience. She really responded to the desert landscape and being aware of the stars and planets. She was a real kind of, she had a mystical quality to her.
I think now people are starting to recognize who Agnes Pelton was, and she was a really important painter. She is sometimes seen in the same camp as Georgia O'Keeffe, and in a way they were both working, kind of in the Southwest, or O'Keeffe in New Mexico and Pelton in California. But Pelton would say, O'Keeffe makes a nice painting of a big decorative flower, and it's a beautiful canvas, but it doesn't really say much. She saw herself as doing something different, as she was saying more, and she's trying to speak to you kind of on a very visceral level.
Agnes was slightly critical of Georgia O'Keeffe's work, saying that it didn't have enough spiritual impact in it, or it didn't have enough sort of uplift of what she was after. You can see in Pelton's work just how kind of profound her reaction to nature was. To see a transformative mountainscape and the sort of things that Pelton does with bursts of water, bursts of air, and you can see it in all 10 artists, very different ways that nature and the spirit can come together. One of the things I'm happiest about doing this exhibition is that it fulfills Raymond Johnson's initial goal in helping form the group in the 30s, which was to give national exposure to these artists, because he felt what they were doing was so important. I'm a big fan of Johnson's work, and his use of sort of planet shapes in landscapes is kind of a must-see. We have great paintings by Emil Bistrom, to one that's kind of a rainbow array of colors bursting out of the canvas. And very happy that we have some very strong Lauren Harrises. But the others are, I think, really fascinating artists. Florence Pierce, she was only 20 years old when she came to Bistrom's school in Taos. And she made some incredible paintings. There are very few of her transcendental paintings that exist, and we have 2 of them, and we have some other works and drawings by her. But she went on, after her husband died, to become a really important minimalist artist. She only died, I think, about 20 years ago, but had a full career of making these beautiful resin works that reflect color in really interesting ways. And that's an aspect of the show that I think is really fascinating. You can kind of see the entire trajectory of 20th century American art through the Transcendental Painting Group. Because if you start with Pelton, her roots were in symbolism at the beginning of the 20th century, and then Florence Pierce at the end of the 20th century was a minimalist. So as you go through, you can kind of see geometric abstraction. Abstract expressionism really plays a part of Lumpkin's work. There's really a variety of styles, but the unifying factor, though, the kind of bottom line, is that this is abstraction that had a kind of different goal, a spiritual goal. What I hope the show presents is how spiritual abstraction can be manifested in 10 different ways through these artists. And I feel like one of the important aspects of this show is its relevancy to contemporary art. There's been so much cynical art. Today, art is so controlled by the art market. Everything in this show is the antithesis of that. This show is, these are completely heartfelt, sincere artists who are not interested in irony in any way, shape, or form. And to me, that's really refreshing and a nice sort of commentary on what's happened in art and how it's kind of opens doors for new possibilities for artists to espouse.
I think people should see this show, first of all, because it's beautiful. Second of all, because it's meaningful. You look at these artworks and you feel it. It really hits you in the heart. And I don't think all art shows do that. In fact, some are very meant to be off-putting, but these are meant to be engaging. They are meant to talk from one person to the other, and they accomplish their goals. And at this moment in time, I think it's very meditative, it's soulful, and I think it's kind of a salve that we all need in terms of, it's healing.
So let us know in the chat if you had a chance to see the exhibition in person. The exhibition truly does have a wonderfully resonant meditative energy. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome critic, writer, and independent curator Michael Duncan to chat more about the exhibition. Hi, Michael.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for putting that together. It was really powerful.
Yeah, it was certainly a different way to see the exhibition, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know it's a late night for you over there on the European continent, so I
Right.
appreciate you staying up and being here to chat with us. But
Right.
I thought we could jump right in. I'm sure we'll get some questions in the chat. I've seen a couple pop up already. But I thought we could begin with where your interest in the Transcendental Painting Group, where it sort of stems from.
Well, I started as an art writer for Art in America, and I quickly became aware of the fact that American art history has so many fantastic artists and groups that haven't received the attention that I believe they deserve. My whole goal as an independent curator is to bring to light art that I feel needs an audience. And and there are very few organized groups in American art history. And the Transcendental Painting Group just sort of spoke to me as a subject for an exhibition that needed to be done. I had seen the Agnes Pelton retrospective back in the late 90s that Michael Zakian had put together for Palm Springs Museum, and I was blown away by her work. I was totally shocked by it, and I wrote a feature for Art in America about that, and that's what started my interest. And the show has had I've was trying to do this show for a long time, and it had several different incarnations before it all came together with the Crocker. Back in, I think I started in 2012, and there was an attempt to put the show together with the Santa Monica Museum, and it was going to be a co-venture of them and the University Art Gallery at University of New Mexico. But that fell apart due to shipping costs. And so I tried for a long time, for several years, to get it going again. And happily, it came together at the Crocker. Scott Shields and Lyle both were enthusiastic about it, and we took the plunge and made it happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, before we hopped on the stream, we were talking a little bit about the Jess exhibition that you organized at the Crocker. So I guess in speaking about the museum, I mean, how did the Crocker fit into the process of organizing the exhibition? And sort of how does the presentation at the museum compare to some of the other stops on the exhibition's tour?
Well, I was very pleased at the Crocker because it was exactly the way I wanted the show to be installed. Some of the other stops on the tour had different ideas. The show was definitely conceived to be installed by artists. I just, in doing the research for the show, I just was completely convinced that each of them had a unique point of view, and that to mix the work all together just would confuse matters. And the group, it's an interesting, the way the group came together was really interesting. They were making abstract work in a state where most people were doing landscape paintings, straight landscape paintings, or reflections on Native American culture. So the fact that they were doing non-objective art and spiritual art was really against the grain. And so they really felt that they should come together to make a statement, to get more attention for themselves. And that was their major motivation. They really, the sort of pie in the sky for them was it was called the Museum of Non-Objective Art, which was what led to the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And they had a lot of flirtation with that institution, but that institution never really espoused what they they showed some of their work, but they never did a Transcendental Painting Group show. So in a way, this show is what those artists really wanted to have happened in their own time. So it's a great pleasure to have made that happen at this point, 80 years later or whatever it is. So yeah, it's great that the Crocker has stood up for a lot of artists that are not the usual suspects, not the ones that are usually shown in the big institutions like Museum of Modern Art or the Art Institute of Chicago, that they're more open to investigate and really expand art history, which is what I think really needs to be done, especially since artists on the West Coast, any artists west of the Mississippi River have been traditionally neglected by the East Coast powerful museums. There is that myopia of New York that sometimes recognizes artists from the West, but not always. And the power structure and the whole kind of museum structure was slow to develop in the 20th century on the West Coast. So I feel strongly that now is the time to play catch up and make art history a more inclusive subject and include all of this nation's artists and not just ones who live on a specific coast and in a specific geographic region. So
I mean, sort of building off that point, and you sort of refer to it in the video too, about talking about sort of the influence on contemporary art practice. But in sort of organizing the exhibition and that process, you see Pelton's work in the 90s, 2012, you tried to start putting something together. I mean, talk us through the process of putting the show together. I mean, what were some of the steps, some of the highlights for you? I know there's a very interesting musical component that you worked you're really proud of in this exhibition. So tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, there were several. First of all, the research for it was really exciting because very little had been written about most of these artists. So there are all sorts of revelations that came about, and I'm very proud of our catalog. And I worked really hard on the biographical essays to show that research and to get the facts out there about these people. But the particular challenges were several. To get the loans, as I was working on the show, a rival exhibition, a solo exhibition of Agnes Pelton's work suddenly came about. So we were tussling for loans, and I was happy to secure the loans that I had already spoken to people about. The other challenge was Lauren Harris, the Canadian artist. His work is very well known in Canada and is his values are really high. So to get those loans from the museums was an expensive and difficult process. So it took a lot of juggling with both Pelton and Harris. And one of the caveats of doing the show with the Crocker was that basically everything had to go to all 5 venues. So some collectors were reluctant to let their work go for over a 2-year period, and that's understandable. So I kept having to change and having to find a new one, and it's like, okay, you won't loan to us, so okay, bye. Let me find another one. But in the end, I really am happy with the selection that we have, and I feel like the work for each artist is a pretty good reflection of what their whole was about. So Yeah, no, I'm completely thrilled with the way the show looks at the Crocker, and the crew was phenomenal, and I think it really reflects well on the group. Oh, and you mentioned the video, which was something I'm really thrilled to have been involved in the making of. Horace Pierce was an artist who believed firmly that film was the medium of the 20th century. And what he wanted to do was make animated abstract films. So he did this one project called Spiral Symphony, and he made 30 drawings that were preparation drawings for that video. And he worked for years to try to get funding to make the animated film and talked to all sorts of people. He tried with Disney while they were making Fantasia and all sorts of things, but the funding never happened. So these 30 drawings existed. They had been gifted to University of New Mexico by Florence Pierce, Horace's wife, after he died. And a lot of curators had talked about somehow making a video of these 30 drawings that sort of simulated the artist's intentions. But the technology really wasn't there back in the people had talked about it in the 80s and the 90s. So I was able to get a video artist in Los Angeles to work with the 30 images, and she put together the beautiful video that we have in the show. And Horace Pierce had spoken to Dane Rudyard, who's kind of the philosopher king of the Transcendental Painting Group, and he was also a really well-known composer. So I was able to find a piece of music that's just over 3 minutes that fit the mood of the drawings. Rudyard had been asked to write the music for it, but since the film never happened, he didn't write that. But I found this other piece that works beautifully with the images. So that's one aspect of this that I'm thrilled to have brought to fruition, and I think everybody that's seen the video has been really blown away by it. It's such a gorgeous, gorgeous thing. So.
I feel like that story is sort of exemplary of the depth of the research that you did in terms of putting this show together. And so I was sort of curious as to, you sort of creating a baseline, sort of putting a spotlight on these artists. I mean, did you find out interesting information that you hadn't known about before during the research process? Does anything sort of in particular stand out for you?
Well, there were a lot of surprising things. One aspect of Agnes Pelton's childhood was that her grandfather was involved in this big scandal. It was a divorce. It was a adultery trial that received all of this national press, and it was sort of a traumatic for her as a young girl. And then when I was researching Robert Gribrick, who's kind of the least known artist of the group, turns out his family was involved in a horrible scandal when he was a young boy. There was a murder of his, a killing of his uncle, and his aunt was accused of it, and it was a whole mess. His parents ended up sending him to a private school 30 miles away from Rochester, New York, where he grew up. So it was kind of fascinating to see that two of the artists had these childhoods that kind of made them more insular. At least that's my theory about them, that made them more reflective, and it made them kind of planted the seeds for them doing something as dramatic as moving from the East Coast to New Mexico and the middle of the desert in California. So I mean, I find all 10 artists to be really fascinating figures, And I'm sure there will be other art historians who take the research I made further, because it's just kind of tip of the iceberg with all of these people. So yeah, no, it was a fascinating project to work on. So.
And you touched on the spiritual component a little bit earlier on. You spoke about the philosophical aspect. So I want to bring in a question from the chat from Sam Reap. I'm going to put up on screen quickly. And so sort of thinking about the similarities or the connections between the sort of Transcendental Painting Group and Theosophy. Is there a connection? Thanks for the question, Sam.
Totally. Yeah, no. So most of the painters were well versed in Theosophy and very deeply into it. Lauren Harris had studied it as a young man in Canada, and both Beestrom and Johnson were sort of acolytes of Nicholas Roersch, who was this Russian or Eastern European painter, philosopher, whose wife had written a kind of theosophical text called Anyi Yogi. Agnes Pelton was well versed in it. So Theosophy is really at the heart of what the whole group was after, and it's very much a part of their work. Beestrom was probably the most kind of strict adherent of Theosophy, and had all sorts of interpretations of the symbolic nature of his forms and what they meant in terms of spiritual uplift or spiritual enlightenment.
You mentioned Johnson, and I know in the video too, there's this interesting section where Scott talks about Agnes's work, and you talk a little bit about Johnson's work. I was sort of curious about what intrigues you about Johnson's work, and then sort of, do any of the other artists in the exhibition have sort of strong philosophical or like theoretical relevance for you?
Yeah, well, they all do, but Johnson, I think Johnson is really interesting because his career was so long. He really worked from the teens through the 70s, and it's a and he was constantly experimenting with form and with medium. He started using airbrush in the late 30s and used it in really creative ways that were very influential to the other members of the group. But his kind of constant investigation, I find him really a compelling figure that should receive more attention from American art historians. It's kind of shocking to me that someone whose work is so strong and so well developed over the decades has not received much attention at all outside of New Mexico.
I mean, so that's a long period to work on this exhibition. I mean, now that it's getting ready to move on to its next location, I mean, what sort of things will you take away from the experience of organizing this exhibition?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting. I think it has changed my kind of interests and tolerance for certain kinds of art that I feel is inconsequential. To me, this art is consequential. You can really go far with it in terms of how it affects you as a human being. And I've become really irritated with a lot of contemporary abstraction that just seems formal, that just seems a retread of abstract expressionism, or some kind of comment on minimalism, or some kind of little, it's a simple pattern that doesn't really do much. And I feel like this work does have a lot of, opens up a lot of doors that abstract artists can explore. And it's just, it's interesting that when I began this project, I was concerned about whether these artists would just be perceived as kind of kooks, as theosophical weirdos. But I think things have changed in the last decade. There seems to be more acceptance of the idea of spirituality and the idea that art can actually elevate the spirit, or that whole kind of strict formalist look at art as I think has the tide has turned, and that people are more open to looking for art that's going to offer them something, that's going to offer something more than just a picture on the wall, or just a commentary on art itself, or a comment on the politics of the moment, or even it transcends identity art, in my opinion, because it's so universal, where you have a moving vector and an orb. These are things that come out of reality and the spirit, and it's what art can do to transform everyday life into something more, and something that offers us more than just waking up and going about our business.
I mean, it was very aptly put. I feel like that's a great way, great place for us to conclude this chat and walk through of the exhibition. I mean, to everybody watching, I mean, as they sort of make their way to the show, I mean, what sort of things should we be looking out for? On the last sort of little bit of the exhibition.
Great, yeah. Just I think each viewer can bring to the show themselves and see themselves reflected in what these artists are trying to convey with these abstract paintings, and their responses to nature, and kind of the whole philosophical approach to life. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for working with us on this project, Michael. It was great to have you this evening. And the video is a real treasure on our YouTube collection. So for everybody watching, that video is going to stay posted on YouTube. And thank you for being here, Michael. I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Be sure to check out our website for the rest of the programs coming up in November, and I hope to see you again soon. Good night.